Perfect.
All right. Hi, friends. Welcome back to Mommas Who Lead, the space where motherhood meets mission, purpose meets power. And every day, women are reminded that their leadership matters at home, in their businesses, and in the world. I'm your host, Laura Carafino, and today's episode is for every mom who's ever looked at the college decision process and thought, is this the right move? Or maybe you've asked, is college still worth the cost? Will my child be safe? How do I know they'll belong? How do I let go and lead them well into adulthood? If you've had any of those thoughts, this episode is for you. And today I'm joined by someone whose wisdom and leadership have shaped generations of students and family. Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum. She is president emeritus of Spelman College. She's a psychologist, award winning author, and one of the most respected voices in higher education. She has just launched her newest book, Peril and Promise: College Leadership in Turbulent Times. It's part memoir, part leadership blueprint, and full of wisdom for anyone raising the next generation in today's shifting world. So, whether you're guiding your high school senior through college decisions, preparing to launch a freshman into the unknown, or reflecting on your own legacy as a mother and a leader, get ready to be both grounded and inspired. Dr. Tatum has spent her career helping students thrive, not just academically, but emotionally, socially, and culturally. In Peril and Promise, she helps us understand what's really happening in higher education and how we, as mothers, leaders, and advocates, can show up with both wisdom and confidence. Dr. Tatum, welcome to Mamas Who Lead. I'm so honored to have you with us.
Well, I'm delighted to be with you, Laura, and looking forward to our conversation.
Likewise. Okay, let's start. What first stirred your heart towards leadership in higher education?
Well, I was a professor of psychology for a long time, and I really enjoyed being a professor. I enjoyed working with my students and doing my research and all the things that professors do. And being a college leader in an official administrative capacity was not on my mind at all for a long time. But after I had been promoted, when you become a professor, you start as an assistant professor, and then you become an associate professor, and hopefully you will eventually become what's called a full professor. And full professor is like the top of the pile in terms of that professorial hierarchy. And when I became a full professor, I had been teaching probably about 17 or 18 years. And was feeling a little restless. There was kind of like, okay, I've achieved this goal. Now what? And I wasn't sure what would be next. But I had the opportunity to serve as the chair of my department. Now, I say opportunity, I didn't really want to do it, but but in higher education, it's often the case that the person who runs the department is a rotating role. People take turns doing it. And it was my turn. My colleague said, Beverly, it's your turn. So I was getting ready to do that, but thinking, this is not really what I'm looking for. What can challenge me? What would be the next exciting adventure professionally for me? And I was thinking about this and talking to a friend, and she said, I think maybe you should be the dean. The dean at that time, I was working at Mount Holyoke College, and the person who held the position of dean of the college was stepping down. And she said, I think you'd be perfect for that role. And I thought and said, who in her right mind would want that job? I didn't think it was, I just imagined it would be one long line of boring meetings. And she said to me, you are not using your imagination. If you were the dean, those ideas you have about how to make the college better, and some of which you've been writing about in your books, you could put those things into practice. And I thought, well, there's an idea. Maybe it would be more interesting than I thought. So I was kind of persuaded to test it out, and I applied for the dean position and was selected. And I quickly learned that it was really interesting and that those meetings that I thought might be boring were much more interesting when you get to plan the agenda for them, right? When they're your meetings. And it was possible to innovate and to do things differently than had been done previously. And I really enjoyed it. Once I had that dean experience, it was a short leap to then start thinking about being a college president.
Wow. That's remarkable. I'm sure like putting your twist on things definitely helps and keeps it interesting.
Yes, for sure.
Was there any moments like early on where you doubted maybe your place in leadership at all?
Regularly, regularly. But one of the things that I did, maybe it's the professor in me, I started reading about leadership.
Mm,
When I was a psychology professor, I taught in my area of expertise, but I wasn't reading books about leadership. But when I became a dean, I read everything I could find about leadership, women's leadership in particular, but not just that. And I found those books really interesting and some of them quite helpful in thinking about what I needed to do, particularly around things like strategic planning or, team building. And I really believe that effective leaders don't lead alone, right? You need a team around you, and getting that team to share the vision and to, as I like to say, get everybody rowing in the same direction so that you can really make progress is essential. And I read a lot about how other people had done that and practiced some of those things myself. But there are certainly the first time I had to um, terminate someone, by that I mean
mm,
fire.
right.
I mean, that's an awkward thing and
Yeah.
um,
Never
you don't,
easy.
never easy. But I learned a lot from the process. I thought of it all as an opportunity to learn. And you make mistakes, of course, but you grow from those mistakes too.
Do you recall any of the books that you were reading at the time that really stand out to you that helped you?
Yes, my favorite one, and I often give it to people when they become new leaders, was titled Leading with Soul. Leading with Soul. And it was an allegorical tale about a leader who was struggling and met with a mentor who offered wisdom. And but the fundamental idea, which I really appreciated in the book, was the idea that you lead from who you are, right? Who you are as a person is at the core of your leadership style. And so if you're confused or struggling, maybe it has to do with an inner struggle that you're having. Maybe it has to do with getting clarity about your goals and what it is you're trying to accomplish. But I
Mm.
found that book really, really helpful. And in the book, there was a poem that was quoted, and the line that I'm going to remember is that, work is love made visible.
Oh, I love that.
I do too. That sentence, work is love made visible, was so meaningful to me because, when you are in a leadership role at a mission-centered organization, leading a college is all about the mission. And if you are really trying to deliver that mission for students every day, it is a form of love that you're expressing, and your work is love made visible.
It is. I love this, especially having children that go to college. And I attended college too, but having your child, you want to have your child to go to colleges where the president, the leadership staff is thinking in this capacity and thinking this way. And I love that leading with love,
Yes,
and love showing up visible. I love that. Now I'm going to get into some little more challenging question here for
sure.
you. You stepped into leadership at a time and in spaces where women were rarely seen at those tables, right? And
Yes.
even fewer women of color. So,
Mhm.
what gave you that confidence to take up that space and keep showing up with strength? Because I'm sure you met some challenges, and I would love to hear those.
Yes, I'm happy to share some. But let me start by saying that I grew up in an unusual circumstance, perhaps different from what maybe many Black women would have experienced.
Mhm.
So I'm going to tell this story from the very beginning because I think it's meaningful.
Love it.
But
Yes.
I was born in 1954. I don't mind saying that. So I'm soon to be 71. My birthday is in September. And when I was born in 1954, my family was living in Tallahassee, Florida.
Mm,
I am the child of educators. My parents both went to Howard University, and my dad became an art professor. And he was teaching at Florida A&M University, which is a historically Black college or university, an HBCU. And back in the 1950s, in 1954, when I was born, my dad had an undergraduate degree from Howard, and he had a master's degree from Iowa State University. And he wanted to get a doctorate. I should say my dad was a veteran. He benefited from the GI Bill. That's how he finished his education and was able to go to graduate school with the GI benefit. But in higher education, to advance, you really need a doctorate. And so for him, he needed to get his doctorate in art education. That was his specialty. And he wanted to do that at Florida State University, which is also in Tallahassee.
mm,
So just across town from where he was working. Unfortunately, in 1954, Florida State was a whites only institution. And even after Brown versus Board of Education, that famous Supreme Court decision that made school segregation unconstitutional, the state of Florida was slow, like a lot of southern states, was slow to implement the desegregation process. But they were required by law to provide access to graduate education that he was seeking. So the way they did that, rather than allow him to attend Florida State, they provided his transportation out of the state. So my dad actually earned his doctorate at Penn State, commuting between Tallahassee, Florida, and State College, Pennsylvania, where Penn State is located. And the state of Florida didn't pay his tuition, but reimbursed his train fare. So when he finished his degree, which he did in 1957, now I'm 3 years old, and my older brother, they had another child at that time who was, 2 years older than me. My older brother was 5, almost 6, about to start school. And my parents decided they did not want him to go to school in that segregated system in Florida. And my dad was looking for a new opportunity and got a job in Bridgewater, Massachusetts, and became the first African American professor at what was then called Bridgewater State Teachers College, now known today as Bridgewater State University. And Bridgewater is about 30 miles outside of Boston, and that's where I grew up. We moved there in 1958, and I grew up there. And I say that to say it was a small New England town, very few
mm.
Black families living in the town. And as a consequence, I was the only Black kid in my classes most of my schooling, from first grade through high school. So,
Wow.
being the only one in the room is not an unusual experience for me. I learned early on how to navigate those spaces. And I did have a certain self-confidence because I was a really good student. And in fact, my mother taught me to read before I got to school. So when I entered first grade, I was a very strong reader when a lot of my classmates were still, learning. And I think that gave me a lot of confidence because I was the only Black kid in the class, but I was also the only one who could read. So
Wow.
my experience in life has been of being in spaces where I felt very competent. I was a competent first grader, and that continued through my schooling. So fast forward when I became a president, walking into spaces where I was the only Black woman was not an unusual experience, but I felt confident in my ability, rooted in my childhood, really.
Oh my goodness, your story is incredible. I didn't realize how incredible it got, but just starting from the beginning, um, oh my goodness, your parents did an amazing job raising you guys, to be resilient, to stand up for yourself and your confidence along the way. Just a remarkable story. Um, Now, what would you say to the young women that maybe don't have that advantage of being raised by strong leaders? Maybe they're beginning their, it may be a teenager or they have dreams of possibly leadership or, and in
Yes.
spaces that maybe are mostly held by men or mostly held by predominantly white, if that may be the case they're looking for, what would she do? What would you tell her to do?
I have a colleague who said something to me once, and that it was this expression. She said, "There is a teacher and a learner in every seat." And what that means is that everybody has something to learn, everybody has something to teach, right? So, there's a teacher and a learner in every seat. And what I would say to that young person is that there's a teacher and a learner in every seat. You have things to learn, but you also have things to teach. And so there are things that you will learn from others in this room, but there are things that others in this room are going to learn from you, and don't deprive them of that opportunity, right? You need to be willing to share what you know, and everybody knows something from their growing up experience, from what they've studied. They're just who they are as people. Each of us has something unique to offer, and to understand that just as that person has something to offer, so do you.
I love that. That is really good to know. Remember whenever you're going through stuff. I always like to say that I'm a lifelong learner. Continue, like I don't know everything, obviously, and I want to, continue that aspect. And I love that message. So let's talk a little bit about your latest book, Peril and Promise. Why
Yes.
why was now the right time to write it, and what promise do you hope women, especially moms, maybe take away from it?
Well, I served as president of Spelman College for 13 years, from 2002 to 2015. And when I left my job in 2015, it was with the idea that I would write a couple of books. And I had two very specific writing projects in mind. And the first one was an update of a book I wrote quite some time ago. That book is called Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, and Other Conversations About Race. And the publisher, it was originally published in 1997. The publisher asked me to update the book for a 20th anniversary reprinting, re-release, which was going to happen in 2017. So from 2015 to 2017, that's what I did. I worked on that book. But then the second book idea, I really wanted to reflect on my own leadership experience at Spelman and write a book that might be inspiring to other college leaders. However, that project got delayed, and it got delayed by the success of the first book, right? When that 2017 book, it became a bestseller, and I spent a lot of time traveling around talking about that book, and also the events of the pandemic and the murder of George Floyd. All of those things converged to create a lot of speaking engagements over Zoom, mostly because of the pandemic, about racism in the United States, and how those were some of the issues I'd written about in that other book. But by the time we got to 2022, I was ready to do something different. I was tired of that activity. It was kind of draining. I found it draining, and I wanted to do something different. And so I thought, well, now's a good time to think about that book. And then my phone rang, and I was invited to come back to Mount Holyoke College, a place I had worked as a faculty member and as the dean. Their president had resigned unexpectedly, and they needed a president to fill in while they did a new presidential search. And so the board chair called me and asked if I would serve as the president for 1 year, and I agreed to do it for 1 year, from 2022 to 2023. So when I took on that job, my friend said to me, "Beverly, have you lost your mind? It's that this is such a hard job. Why would you come out of retirement to do this?" And parents, and people, strangers sitting next to me on a plane, lots of people asked, like, isn't that such a hard job being a college president today? And, I don't understand why colleges aren't like the way they were when I was a student. I was getting these kinds of questions and comments all the time. So that kind of changed my mind about the kind of book I should write. And what I decided to do when I finished my year at Mount Holyoke was to work on a book that would really be kind of an insider's guide to higher education, using my decades of experience, having been an academic all my life, really, and translate how colleges work, how financial aid works, how enrollment works, how uh, student protests get resolved on campuses when they happen, all of those things that many people wondered about. Higher ed has been in the news a lot lately, and yet people who are not up close and personal with college environments as employees or as leaders are confused by the way colleges work. So I thought I would try to give it a user's guide in a way.
It
Um,
is. It's good. It is so good. And if you're listening, pick up this book, Peril and Promise. It is so good. And I absolutely love it. I wish I would have had it when my daughter was first looking at colleges. And and it came out the perfect timing because you were actually leading during these most culturally tense moments in education. And there was just a lot going on college campuses during this time, and still, unfortunately. But what does it look like from the leadership aspect during these times for you every day? Like how, as a leader in that position, because I don't think people understand how difficult it really is.
It is a challenge. Sometimes I say it's kind of like being mayor of a small town,
Mm.
running a college, in the sense that, you've got all these different departments, but at any moment something can go wrong, right? The water main can break, the literally and figuratively, the water main on campus could break. Something can go wrong, or, there can be a student emergency, or there can be, a strike, unionized workers, or there can be um, a pandemic and you have to send students home.
Mm.
You never know. In some ways, that's what I liked about the job, that you never knew from day to day what exactly was going to be happening. So it was always challenging, never boring. But um,
It kept you on your toes.
yes, yes. And one of the things I say in the book is that there are, as challenging as the job can be running a college, there are things that really are sources of joy.
Mm.
One of them is the people you meet, right? You meet incredible students, incredible scholars, but also the parents of the students, the people who come to visit the campus, who come to give talks. You just meet, the donors who help support the institution. You meet a tremendous array of wonderful people who you might not ever have otherwise had a chance to meet, but you also get to solve problems. And why is problem solving fun? Like, why do people do crossword puzzles? It engages the mind, it gets you focused, and there are important things that you need to think about in the company of other creative problem solvers. Problems let problem solvers shine. And that is also exciting in a way, overwhelming sometimes, but it can be exciting. But really, the most important thing is the purpose. What is the purpose of higher education? If you take young people, and they're not all young, I mean, some of them are older
Right.
returning students, veterans coming to school after having served, or somebody making a career change. But when someone comes to college or a university, they're looking for an opportunity to develop themselves in some important way. And the kind of transformation that can happen when someone is exposed to new ideas, new people, when they have the opportunity to test their own creative problem solving, is really very exciting to watch and to be a part of. And ultimately, our society, not just the person, but the society benefits from folks who have learned to think critically, who have become creative problem solvers. We have complex social problems that need to be addressed, and we need people who have learned how to engage with people different from themselves, who have learned to think critically, ask good questions, to be part of that problem solving process.
I love that. And as we're talking about like that process, So many of our listeners are moms walking with their kids through college decisions or,
Hmm.
even consider maybe going back themselves, having that career transition. What are three questions that they should be asking that don't show up in those glossy brochures?
One question for sure they should ask is not so I'm going to describe it as an experience, right? And that question is, am I in the picture? What does that
Mm,
mean? You know, when we enter spaces, whether it's a college environment or a work environment, we want to see ourselves reflected in that space. You know, we want to know, are there people like me here?
mm,
Not that everybody has to look like me, I don't mean that, but are there people who will understand where I'm coming from, who will see me, appreciate what I have to offer, and acknowledge the contributions I can make? And you might say, well, how will you know if that's going to happen or not? One way to get a hint is to see whether you find yourself in the environment, right? So I use an analogy in my book. I talk about affirming identity as something that every college should be doing. And what does that mean? It means that if you, let's say you're a single mom and you are coming back to school, are there other single moms who've come back to school there? Is there a program to support parenting students? Is there, do you see yourself reflected in the way the college is structured and organized? Some places have programs specifically for non-traditionally aged women returning to school. Spelman had one of those programs. Mount Holyoke has a program like that. There are places that do. And those places are likely to be more affirming, more supportive than places that haven't thought about that, as an example.
mm.
Um, for, when I was taking my children around to colleges, my older son, who at the time seemed kind of shy, definitely an introvert, I worried that he'd make friends at school. You know, these were the kinds of things that as a mom I was thinking about. And when we were visiting colleges, he had a particular interest in Japanese animation. And he loved a particular movie that had been produced by a famous Japanese animator. And when we visited the campus that he ultimately chose, it was in part because he saw they were screening that movie
Oh, wow.
on that campus. He saw a poster advertising the movie being screened, and that single signal to him, there are people here who share my interest, right? And
Yes.
that was a signal. So looking for those signals, places where you can find yourself in the picture. You know, if there's a photograph, do you see yourself in it? That's what people are looking for. And if you find that, that's a good clue. But another very practical question is to ask about graduation rates, right?
Mm,
Because everyone who starts college thinks they're going to graduate. That's the plan, right? But we know that at many colleges, the graduation rate is not that great. It can
mm,
be as low as 20 or 30%. That means 70% of the people are not graduating. So I would always ask, what's your graduation rate? And then ask further, what's the graduation rate or how many students like me have been in your area of interest? Let's say you've got a daughter who's interested in studying physics. Are there any women in the physics department? There are
mm,
some campuses where the answer to that question is yes, but there are a lot of campuses where the answer to that question might be no. If she's really keen to be in the physics department, she might find she likes philosophy or psychology better, and there's no reason to not change her mind. You know, the students change their majors all the time. But you don't want people to feel like they are being pushed out of a field because somebody thinks they don't belong there. So
mm.
that's, particularly women in STEM, for example, is a place where I'd want to know, what is the percentage of women majoring in STEM? I know you've got a fabulous computer science department. Are there any women in it? You know, those are the kinds of questions that I would ask.
That would have been a good question. My daughter is in STEM, so that would have been a good question to ask. Luckily, there are women in um, her sciences, and so she's doing okay. But
I'm
I
glad to
wish
know
I
that.
would have asked that before. I'm like thinking like this is so brilliant. Like how did I not know to ask that? Um, but I also want to talk about something you mentioned it in the book, and that was intrusive advising. That was
Yes.
another key thing that I thought was very important to know. And I didn't even think about it because my daughter has struggled. She is in forensic science, that's her major, and
Mhm.
she had issues with organic chemistry. A lot of people have organic chemistry problems, but I didn't know how bad it was. If I would have had that, um, even asked if they did that, that would have been a key factor. So I'd love to say, this is where schools are proactively, they reach out to support students. I know for me personally that would have been a game changer. Why do you believe that is, especially for first generation or underrepresented students?
It's so important. So for people who are wondering, what do we mean by intrusive advising? It's advising where the university, using data that they collect, is able to track how students are doing and intervene early on before the problem gets too great.
Mhm.
So, for example, if um, there's a chemistry class and a student has missed a couple of the labs, there's a way for the professor to let the advisor know, gee, Beverly wasn't in lab today. She wasn't in lab last week. I'm really worried she's going to fall behind. We've got a midterm coming up. My advisor, in an intrusive way, doesn't wait for me to show up and say, oh, I'm having trouble in that chemistry class. He might or she might reach out to me and say, Beverly, I see that you've been, your professor's telling me you've been absent. I am wondering what's going on. And then I might say, well, actually, I'm a commuter student. My car broke down. I haven't been able to get to campus. And so it's a $500 repair. I don't have any money to fix it. I don't know what to do. There are some institutions, Georgia State University is the model of this, that has emergency loans. You need $500 to fix your car so you can finish your chemistry class. I can help you with that.
Oh,
There's a fund specifically to help students to solve those kinds of problems so that they don't get derailed by something, why let your education go down the tubes for the lack of $500, right? We can
right.
solve that problem. Um, that's just one example, but it might be something else. It might be um, intrusive advising might be you need to, I'm coming to class, but particularly as you said, like a first gen student might feel like, do I really belong here? Everybody else seems to know what they were doing.
Mhm.
They went to high schools where they had a chemistry lab and they learned the techniques. My high school didn't have a chemistry lab. I didn't learn the techniques. I'm really feeling pretty insecure. Um, Maybe there's an intrusive intervention that's not about, you need some money, but maybe you need a tutorial. Maybe you need a lab partner that can, show you the ropes. We
Mhm.
can set that up. Maybe there's an opportunity to get more academic support, at least at the beginning. But this notion that some students feel like if they reveal that they're having trouble, it will validate their fear that they don't really belong there. There's a term for that. It's called stereotype threat. If
Mhm.
I'm worried that raising my hand and saying I'm having trouble is going to confirm the stereotype that women don't belong in STEM, maybe I'm not going to raise my hand and ask. But if I don't raise my hand and ask, I'm going to remain confused. How can a professor or an advisor interrupt that? Here's one way they can do it. For example, a professor could say, everyone I expect to see everyone in my office hours at least once in the first 3 weeks of class. Just come and ask a question. You don't have to be having a problem, but I want everyone at least one time to come visit me in my office hours. That normalizes help seeking, right?
Mhm.
Because if I'm hesitant to reveal my vulnerability, I don't want to show up at the office hour. But if the faculty member says, I expect to see everyone at least once, then I'm going to go. And in the privacy of that conversation, I might feel more comfortable saying, I had this question. I didn't want to raise my hand in class, but, you know, this is what's going on with me. Those kinds of interventions are used in some places, but not always in other places. And you can get a hint about that by simply asking, do you have intrusive advising? Or what supports are in place for first gen students? Some some places have programs that are specifically designed to support first generation students. We often talk about legacy students. Those are the students whose parents graduated from an
Mm.
institution, and so they're the legacy. At Spelman, we used to have legacy students, but we also had what we called Genesis students. And those were students who were starting the legacy, right? You're the first one to come. And so there's something special about being a Genesis student.
Absolutely. I love that. I wish more colleges oh, and I think you probably based on the type of college it is, private, nonprofit, private or public, I think that also may have a factor maybe about that. Like, why wouldn't all colleges, universities offer this? I would think they would benefit, especially the graduation rates.
Yes. Well, we often think about some of the things I'm describing. You might think, oh, well, they do that at, small liberal arts colleges because it's a small community, more personalized, et
Mm,
cetera. But I really want to again lift up the example of Georgia State University. It is a large urban in the
mm.
center of Atlanta, but they have really done a great job of harnessing technology. They are running their computers every day, checking on the data that they have about student attendance. Sometimes students, again, because they don't always know what the best choices are, a student might say, I want to be a chemistry major, but that requires to take certain courses in certain sequence. You have to have intro or and then you have to have organic, then you have to have inorganic. I'm making this up. But my point is, if you don't follow the sequence, you can't get all the courses you need in a timely way. And that also can be derailing. But if there's someone who is looking using computer technology at what you have registered for in the first week of the semester, and they see that, oh, you want to be a chemistry major, but you didn't register for this required course, someone can then alert you to say, look, if you want to follow that sequence, you're going to need this course that you haven't signed up for. That kind of feedback is being done on a large scale, and Georgia State has erased um, the graduation gap between low income students and middle income students. They're graduating at the same rate. They've erased the graduation discrepancy between Black students and white students, first gen and um, not first gen students, students who have coming from a college going family background. It's been quite remarkable. They've gotten a lot of kudos for it, and other institutions are starting to say, how can we do what they're doing? But it's a very large public institution. So I think it's important to say good practices can come from all parts of the higher ed sector.
Mm. Hopefully, more will start adapting that process.
Yes.
Because I know my daughter would have benefited greatly from that, and even myself many, many years ago. Um, what do you think are some of the lesser known pressures that students face once they're on campus? And how can moms help their kids be emotionally and mentally prepared?
Yes. One of the things that was really striking to me when I first came back to Mount Holyoke
Mm,
was the growing demand for mental health services on campus.
mm,
I worked there in the 80s and 90s. I
mm,
returned in, 2022. So I'd been away from the campus 20 years. And in that 20-year period, the demand for mental health services had really escalated. Some of that prompted by, I think, the stresses of the pandemic, on that generation of students who really suffered in terms of social isolation, not being able to connect with friends in the usual way in their adolescence. But more than anything, I think we see the impact of that handheld technology, that smartphone, right? You see people walking down the street. What are they doing? They're looking at their phones. It's a wonder we're not all tripping and falling more, you know. But you see people so engaged with this technology. And research is showing us that the more you use that phone, that screen, the less likely you are even if you're engaging with people on the phone. You might be, texting, you might be doing Instagram, you might be engaging in social media, but it doesn't take the place of face-to-face contact. And our
Mhm.
human psychology is organized for the benefits of face-to-face interaction. So there's an epidemic of loneliness among this generation of young people, m- lonelier than old people. We often think about, old people living alone, being lonely. The most lonely demographic right now are, the college age student.
Mm.
And research shows that if they reduce their phone use, their screen time, they feel better. They're happier, less depressed, less anxious, more likely to be engaged in interactions with other human beings in person. And so there's a recommendation in the book that says doing anything. It doesn't matter whether it's going bowling or taking a walk or, studying together in the library. Any activity that has you off a screen is likely to increase your mood and you're going to feel less depressed. So if there's one thing that we could say to our young people, it would be put the phone down. Put the phone down, at least for a little while, you
Yes.
know.
I agree with that one 100%. I took a social media break for a while and I am enjoying myself without it. And
It's
there's
amazing how much
it
time
is.
you use up when you're,
Yes. It's
scrolling.
easy. And, my younger kids, I'm like, my little ones, they don't obviously have anything like that, but my older, I mean, they're adults, so they do. And I'm like, okay, let's go do something. Go see a friend, please. Go do something. Get off your phone.
Yes. Yes.
It makes a huge difference. And so, and I agree with that. My kids, I had one that graduated during the COVID pandemic, and then I have the little one was born during that pandemic, and even speech delays because of not the interaction, but huge difference. I want to touch on one thing, a couple of more things real quick before we get off of here. And maybe we can get through them. If not, maybe I'll have to invite you back. This has been such a great conversation, and I think very needed too. Um, there was one thing I saw, or well, I was reading, and that is about the cost of college.
Yes.
How can families evaluate whether college is worth it now? And what are the right things to focus on beyond just the tuition?
It's a great question. The first thing that I would say is that when we talk about college cost, many people are concerned about debt. I don't want my child to graduate with a lot of debt. And there are many choices, but there's one choice in particular that should probably, that is the riskiest choice. The riskiest choice is attending a for-profit institution. Now, what do you mean by that? There are, large public universities, state funded. There are small public institutions, small private institutions, large private institutions, but they're all not for profit, which means their major goal is to educate the students.
Mhm.
But there are some businesses which are under the using the college label, but fundamentally they're businesses. They're for-profit businesses. And those for-profit businesses are also sometimes referred to as career academies or but the prime when you're if you're defined as a for-profit business, your number one priority is not the education, it's the business. It's making the money, right? So for-profit organizations often advertise in low-income communities, often are advertising in places where people are looking for an opportunity because they don't have access to a college nearby or something like that. And The graduation rates are very low and the debt ratios are very high. So people pay a lot of money to go. And then because for-profit institutions, generally speaking, don't have the same credibility in the workplace as the not-for-profit organizations do, they
Mhm.
don't necessarily translate into the employment opportunities that the person is hoping for. So graduating with debt and having a limited opportunity is a really bad combo.
Mhm.
Most, however, institutions that your listeners would be considering are not for profit. And those not for profit organizations, again, I would ask, what's the graduation rate? And what is the average cost? You know, you can find today colleges that cost as much as $100,000 a year. You know, there's some really well-known, highly selective institutions. Uh, Vanderbilt, I think, was Vanderbilt University, I think, was the first one to hit the $100,000 mark.
Mhm.
But very few people are going to pay $100,000
Right.
because they're going to offer a lot of financial aid. And that sticker price sounds a lot, but maybe somebody's only paying $15,000 a year or $20,000 a year. So you really have to, what I would say is don't be scared off by the sticker price. Ask what the financial aid packages typically are because there's some places where students, if their family incomes are low, are going virtually for free. And so it's not necessarily a choice between a school I can't afford and, a lot of debt. But in the book, I try to explain how you can assess that and why it's necessary. Sometimes people just say, well, why does it cost so much? Can't you just lower the price? And the
Mm.
problem there is that colleges, the number one expense on any college campus are the people who work there.
Right.
And if you have, I'm going to make these numbers up, if you have 200 faculty members and those 200 faculty members want a raise, which they do because that's, inflation and, prices
Right.
escalating, those 200 people want a raise, where is the raise money going to come from? For most institutions, it's going to come from what students pay.
Mhm.
So if I need to give you a raise, I'm going to have to charge somebody else some more money.
Right.
Now, if I could admit many more students, the overall cost would go down. But in most cases, I'm not able to admit many more students. But some colleges have solved this problem. One college that solved this problem is Southern New Hampshire University. And how did they solve it? They went online.
Mm.
And by going online, they were able to reach many more people, still with the same number of faculty members, right?
Right.
They were able to reduce the cost overall. But that is a fundamental problem. And I think it's a social problem. How do we invest in the next generation? There's some places, some countries in Europe where college is free, essentially,
Mhm.
because the government pays for it, because they think it's important to provide that kind of development for their citizenry. Here, we think of it as a private good, therefore you should pay for it yourself.
Right. Right. I mean, yeah, it's that was another big thing we were navigating. I just paid off my college tuition about a decade ago. So it's a long process, and I know that was one of the things my daughter was. That she's like, whether or not does she go on for grad school, and she's
Hmm.
like, well, or do I work now? I don't want to have a lot of debt. I'm like, don't worry about that piece right now. I was like, think about the benefit, but I'm going to have her read your book too because I think it's going to give her incredible insight as well instead of just listening to what mom and dad says. um, well, there is another. I hope we have a couple time. Do you have time for a few more questions?
A few, sure.
Okay. There was one powerful thread in your book. It is about the rise of political tension and anti-DEI policies. How do we raise kids who stay grounded in who they are, even in these environments that might not reflect their values?
You know, It's a great question. And there is an example in chapter 2 of a young man who was raised in a family that would be in the anti-DEI camp, right? Was raised in a white nationalist family. And so he came to a college where he met people that he had not had a chance to get to know before. He got to know Jewish people. He got to know people of color. Some of those people became his friends, and through those relationships, he abandoned the ideology that his parents espoused. Now, some people would say, well, he didn't hold true to the values of his family, and his family certainly was upset that he did not. Um, but from his point of view, he felt like he had learned more about the world and could see for himself that people that he'd been taught to mistrust or even to disparage were people who had something to teach him that he could learn from, and that he did not want to leave those people out of his life. So,
Mm,
in that sense, his values changed. Now, was
yes,
that a good thing or was it a bad thing? Um, from my point of view, it was a good thing, right? Because
absolutely.
he became more open, more welcoming. But from his family's point of view, it's not what they wanted him to do. It was not what they wanted to happen when he
Mm,
went off to college. It's not what they expected or wanted. So
mm,
I think we have to think about the fact that when we come to when a young person enters a new learning environment, they're going to engage with people different from themselves. They're going to hear new ideas. They're going to learn history they didn't know before. They're going to have experiences that open their minds, and their thinking may shift in ways that we can't always predict. That's part of the learning process. That said, if the values are values like keeping an open mind, being kind to others, treating people the way you want to be treated, I think you'll find that most institutions support and encourage that kind of social responsibility.
yes, I think that is so good advice. And there was another thing that I loved that in your book was you introduced the ABCs of inclusive community. Can you
Yes,
share a little bit about that?
yes, yes. So, when I became dean back at Mount Holyoke in 1998, I had ideas about what I wanted to accomplish. And at the very first meeting of all of the staff who reported to me, I said to them, our goal should be to affirm the identities of all of our students, to build a community where everyone feels included and we're all working toward a common goal, and where we are cultivating the leadership of the next generation of leaders. Our students is that, they are the next generation of leaders. And so we need to be thinking about how what we do collectively does that. How does it affirm identity? How does it build community? How does it cultivate leadership? And that question that I posed came to be known in that community and ever since as the ABCs: A, affirming identity; B, building community; C, cultivating leadership. We talked a little bit about the affirming identity part, the fact that we all want to be seen, heard, and understood in the identities that are most important to us. We all have a lot of identities, You can describe yourself as a mom, as a lifelong learner, as a spouse, as a woman, as a veteran or a part of a military family. I can describe myself in lots of different ways too. Some of those identities are more important to us than others. But the parts of our identity, for me, if I say I'm a Black female, I want people to acknowledge my Blackness and also my femaleness, and maybe also that, I spent a long time in school and have a PhD, and all those things are important. But having said that, when we enter spaces, we want to feel as though we're being recognized and acknowledged in the identities that are important to us. Sometimes that's our racial identity, our ethnic identity, could be our religious identity. Um, an example of affirming a religious identity at Mount Holyoke. Um, there was a Jewish population, not large, but the Jewish holidays, the Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur,
Mhm,
usually happen in September, sometimes early October,
mhm,
and it's common to celebrate the end of the fasting period with a meal called the Break the Fast meal. And I wanted to affirm the identities of our Jewish students to let them know that we saw and appreciated their presence by hosting a Break the Fast dinner for the Jewish student organization. They came to the president's house. We had that dinner. And it was a lovely event, and they could bring friends if they wanted to invite some friends who were not Jewish. But it was an opportunity to say, we see you, we recognize you, we acknowledge your presence at a time when you're having a special celebration. Let's acknowledge that. That kind of thing affirms identity. It also builds community when you bring people together, but it also models cultivating leadership. Because if you haven't grown up in a very diverse community, you might not have had much opportunity to practice. You might not have had time to think about or practice thinking about what other people's needs might be. But when you see it modeled, you start to learn how to do it. And we want that next generation of leaders to be able to go out in the world and engage effectively with people whose life experience is different from their own.
absolutely. What gives you hope about this next generation and the mothers raising them?
I think the fact that someone like you is having this podcast, meaning asking questions, not assuming you know everything, but trying to hear from folks who might give you a new perspective. I Not everybody I know has a podcast, but I know lots of women who are trying to do that, who recognize maybe they didn't have as much opportunity to get to know people outside of a particular demographic. And so they're reaching out to be what I call border crossers, to get to know people whose experiences are different from them. And moms who are border crossers, and I'm talking not geographically, but,
Right.
symbolically. Moms who are border crossers have children who learn how to be border crossers. And that, whenever I see that happening, I feel hopeful.
I love this. Thank you, Dr. Tatum. This has been an incredible conversation, an empowering conversation. Is there anything else you would love to share with our listeners before we leave?
What I would simply want them to remember to think about is that education is not just a private good. It is good for the individual, gives you more opportunity economically. Many benefits come from a college education, but it's also important for our society. It's important for our democracy. It's important for our place in the global community that we're all a part of. And it's important for people who are learning to think critically, to apply that trained intelligence to the complex problems of our day. That matters to all of us.
I love it. And lastly, where can our listeners grab Peril and Promise and connect with you further?
At any bookstore near you, it's widely available. And for those who like to order online, bookshop.org will benefit your local independent bookstore. I always like to say that.
Oh, I love that.
And I have a website, beverlydanieltatum.com. You can find me there.
I'll put all of this in our show notes below as well. And to the mama listening, I hope this episode gave you the space to breathe, reflect, and remember you don't have to have it all figured out. You don't have to do it all perfectly, but you are called to lead right here, right now, whether you're raising a future college freshman or stepping into your own next season. Let this episode be your reminder that leadership starts with presence. Go grab Dr. Tatum's book. Peril and Promise College Leadership in Turbulent Times. The link is here in the show notes, and this episode resonated with you. Please send it to another mom who's walking through the same season. Until next time, keep leading, keep growing, and keep believing in what is possible.